a distant African village surrounded by thick forests and vast plains, there lived a man named Jabari. Jabari was known for his great strength and unshakable bravery. He was respected among the villagers and often helped solve disputes with his wise words and fearless actions. He was married to a beautiful woman named Amani, who was the light of his life. Amani had smooth, dark skin and radiant eyes that reflected kindness. She was loved by everyone in the village for her gentle nature, and she would often be seen tending to the elders or playing with the children. Jabari and Amani had always shared a strong bond. However, there was one problem. Jabari had a temper that could flare up like a sudden storm. When he was angry, he didn't think clearly, and his rage often clouded his judgment. Amani, with her calm and patient heart, would always try to soothe him, but sometimes even her gentle words were not enough. One evening, after a long day of work, Jabari returned home to find Amani cooking his favorite meal, a stew with spices from the forest. But something was different about that day. Jabari was already in a bad mood, frustrated from an argument he had earlier with some villagers. As he sat down to eat, Jabari noticed that the stew was too salty. A small thing, but in his angry state, it felt like a great insult. "How could you ruin this?" he yelled at Amani, his eyes burning with rage. Amani, startled, tried to explain. "Jabari, it was a mistake. I can make another pot." But her words only fueled his anger. "You always do this. You never listen," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table, making the wooden bowls rattle. Amani, hurt and confused, lowered her head. She knew Jabari's temper well, but this time his anger felt different. In his fury, Jabari stormed out of the house, leaving Amani in tears. He didn't look back, his mind spinning with thoughts of betrayal and disappointment. He walked deep into the forest, where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant calls of animals. Hours passed, and his anger only grew. He convinced himself that Amani had wronged him, that she had done it on purpose to make him feel small in front of the village. His thoughts became twisted, and soon he started to believe that the only way to end his suffering was to get rid of Amani completely. The next morning, Jabari returned home, but his heart was still heavy with anger. Amani greeted him with a soft smile, trying to mend the broken connection between them. But Jabari refused to meet her gaze. "You've ruined everything," he muttered under his breath. Amani, sensing the darkness in his voice, backed away. Over the next few days, Jabari's coldness towards her only grew. He barely spoke to her, and when he did, his words were filled with bitterness. Amani didn't understand what had gone wrong. She prayed to the ancestors for guidance, but no answers came. One night, under the cover of darkness, Jabari decided to act on the terrible thoughts that had been consuming him. He waited until Amani had fallen asleep, her breathing soft and peaceful. Quietly, he crept out of the house and gathered a shovel. His hands trembled as he walked to the edge of the forest, where the trees stood tall and the shadows danced in the moonlight. There, he began to dig. Each scoop of dirt felt heavier than the last, but Jabari's mind was set. He believed that once Amani was gone, his pain would vanish too. After hours of digging, the hole was deep enough. Jabari returned to the house, his heart racing. Gently, he lifted Amani from their bed, carrying her to the grave he had prepared. She didn't stir, still deep in her sleep. Jabari placed her in the ground, covering her slowly with dirt. As the last handful of earth fell over her, the wind began to howl, and the trees swayed as if they were trying to stop him. But Jabari ignored the signs. His heart was too full of anger to notice the warnings from nature. When the deed was done, Jabari stood over the grave, breathing heavily. He thought he would feel relief, but instead an empty void began to grow inside him. He turned and walked back to the house, hoping that sleep would take away the weight in his chest. But sleep did not come easily that night. Jabari tossed and turned, haunted by strange dreams. In his dreams, he saw Amani standing at the edge of the forest, her eyes full of sorrow. She didn't speak, but her presence made his heart ache. Next morning, Jabari woke up in a cold sweat. The house felt eerily quiet without Amani's soft humming as she prepared breakfast. Jabari tried to go about his day as usual, but something was wrong. Everywhere he went, he felt her presence. He could hear her voice in the wind, calling his name. "Jabari, why have you done this?" the voice whispered. He shook his head, trying to convince himself that it was all in his mind. But as the days passed, the voice grew louder, following him wherever he went. Jabari began to avoid the edge of the forest where he had buried Amani. But no matter how far he went, the voice never left him. "Jabari, I am still here. Why did you bury me?" it said, soft yet piercing. His heart pounded in his chest every time he heard her. He knew he had done something unforgivable, but he was too afraid to face the consequences. The villagers began to notice the change in Jabari. The once strong and proud man was now a shadow of himself, his face pale and his eyes sunken. Weeks passed, and Jabari grew weaker. He could no longer eat or sleep properly. The voice haunted him day and night, and he could feel Amani's presence growing stronger. He knew that he couldn't run from his guilt forever. One night, unable to bear the torment any longer, Jabari went to the village elder, a wise man named Kwame, who had lived through many seasons. "Elder, I have done something terrible," Jabari confessed, his voice trembling with fear. Kwame looked at Jabari with kind but stern eyes. "Tell me what you have done, my son," he said calmly. Jabari, his voice barely a whisper, told Kwame about the night he buried Amani alive. Kwame listened carefully, his face unreadable. When Jabari finished, there was a long silence. "You have committed a great wrong, Jabari," Kwame finally said. "But the spirits are not seeking revenge. They want you to make peace with your actions." Jabari, confused, asked, "How can I make peace with something so unforgivable?" Kwame stood up slowly, his bones creaking with age. "You must return to the place where you buried Amani and set her spirit free," he said. "Only then will the voices stop." Jabari's heart sank. The thought of returning to that place filled him with dread, but he knew he had no other choice. That night, under the full moon, Jabari made his way back to the edge of the forest. The wind was cold, and the trees whispered in the darkness. With each step, the voice of Amani grew louder. "Jabari, I am waiting for you," it said, filled with both sorrow and forgiveness. When Jabari reached the grave, he fell to his knees, his body shaking with guilt and fear. "Amani, I am sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. He began to dig, his hands moving frantically through the dirt. As he dug, the voice softened. "Jabari, I forgive you, but you must forgive yourself." Jabari's tears mixed with the soil as he uncovered the grave. But when he reached the bottom, Amani was gone. The grave was empty, and all that was left was the cool earth beneath his hands. Jabari sat there in the silence of the night, his heart heavy. Amani's spirit had been freed, but the weight of his guilt still pressed down on him. He realized then that the voice wasn't just Amani's, it was the voice of his own conscience, reminding him of the terrible mistake he had made. The forgiveness she had offered him was not enough to heal the pain inside his soul. Jabari knew that he had to find a way to forgive himself if he ever wanted to find peace. The next morning, the villagers discovered what Jabari had done. Some were horrified, while others were filled with anger. But Kwame the elder gathered the people and spoke. Jabari's actions were wrong, but he is already paying the price. His heart is burdened with guilt, and no punishment we give him will be greater than the one he has given himself. The villagers, although hesitant, agreed to let Jabari live in peace. They understood that the torment he felt was punishment enough. Jabari spent the rest of his days in solitude, living at the edge of the forest. He built a small shrine in Amani's memory, where he would go every day to pray for her forgiveness. The voice of Amani still haunted him, but it had softened over time, no longer filled with the same sorrow. Instead, it was a reminder of the lessons he had learned. The power of anger, the weight of guilt, and the path to redemption. As the years passed, Jabari's hair turned gray, and his body grew frail, but he never stopped visiting Amani's shrine. He planted flowers around it, letting nature slowly reclaim the land where his dark deed had taken place. The villagers, seeing his devotion and the way he had distanced himself from his old fiery temper, began to soften their views of him. Some would even come to him for advice, as he had grown wise in his isolation, understanding the depth of his own mistakes and the consequences of acting out of anger. One day, a young boy from the village approached Jabari as he sat by the shrine. The boy had heard the stories about what Jabari had done, but instead of fear or judgment, the child looked at him with curiosity. "Why do you sit here every day, Jabari?" the boy asked. Jabari smiled weakly, his tired eyes filled with sadness and reflection. "I sit here to remember," he said softly. "I remember the person I hurt, and I remember that no matter how great the pain, forgiveness is the path to healing." The boy, still confused, asked, "Do you think Amani forgives you?" Jabari looked up at the sky, where the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the village. "I believe she does," he answered. "But it is I who must forgive myself." Anger can cloud your mind and lead you to do terrible things, but it is never too late to learn from your mistakes. The boy nodded, understanding now that the true lesson was not just in what had happened, but in how Jabari had chosen to live afterward. The story of Jabari and Amani teaches us that acting in anger can lead to deep regret and sorrow. It reminds us that forgiveness, both of others and of ourselves, is the key to healing. Jabari's journey shows that even the heaviest guilt can be lightened when we seek to make amends and learn from our mistakes. Anger, if left unchecked, can destroy the things we love, but there is always a path to redemption if we are willing to face our actions with humility and strive to become better people. This tale, rooted in African culture, highlights the importance of family, respect, and personal growth. By focusing on the human experience, it resonates with people of all ages, teaching that we should always strive for patience, understanding, and forgiveness, no matter how dark the road may seem.